Part 2, Caves. Some time later Adela idly mentions she would have liked to visit the Murabar caves. A servant overhears her, and by the time the story reaches Aziz, he is convinced he has deeply insulted the ladies. He goes about organizing an expedition, enlisting Fielding to approach Rani and Major Calendar, inviting Godbally, asking favors, and spending lots of money. The ladies accept, but when the time comes to leave, Fielding and Godbally are too late to board the train, much to Aziz's distress. But he then realizes he is free of English control for once. The ladies have felt odd since hearing the song at Fielding's, and are not particularly enthusiastic. They discuss the advancing hot weather and Adela's impending marriage. Adela is disappointed by the elephant Aziz has hired and by the practical jokes he is playing. The ladies are not impressed by the caves, but they do enjoy Aziz's stories of the Mughal emperors. Adela offends Aziz by saying all English ladies become rude to Indians after a year. When they tour the first cave, there is a disturbing echo, and Mrs. Moore panics, feeling suffocated in the dark, crowded cave. Mrs. Moore is haunted by the echo, which seems to have rendered everything in life meaningless. Mrs. Moore declines to see any more caves, so Adela and Aziz visit the next cave with only a guide. Thinking of her marriage, Adela asks Dr. Aziz if he is married and if he has more than one wife. This offends Aziz deeply, causing him to duck into a cave suddenly. When he leaves the cave, he panics when he doesn't find Adela, so he strikes the guide. But he then sees Adela getting into Miss Derek's motor car. Believing all is well, he goes back to camp after picking up Adela's binoculars, which have a broken strap. Upon returning, he is happy to see Fielding, who arrived with Miss Derek. But Fielding is concerned when he learns the two ladies have suddenly driven off to Chandrapur. When they arrive at the train station in Chandrapur, Aziz is arrested. Fielding intends to stay with Aziz but is called away by Turton, who speaking with great emotion tells him Adela has accused Aziz of assaulting her in the cave. Fielding is incredulous and calls Adela mad, which enrages Turton. When Fielding asks to speak to Adela, he is told she is ill. Superintendent of Police McBride, who privately thinks all natives are criminals at heart, tells Fielding about the charges against Aziz and about the binoculars, which seem to be evidence of the assault. McBride says he has evidence of Aziz's character, holding up a letter found on Aziz from a friend who owns a brothel in Calcutta. Fielding asks to speak to Adela, because he wants someone who believes in Aziz to question her about the incident, but Major Calendar won't allow it. McBride tells Fielding the English must now stick together. When Fielding asks to visit Aziz, he is told he must apply to the city magistrate Rani. Then more evidence is brought in from Aziz's bungalow, including a photo McBride refuses to believe is of Aziz's wife. Fielding then meets Hamidullah. He thinks Hamidullah has been too timid in supporting Aziz. In addition to Mahmood Ali, Hamidullah is considering Amritrao, a well-known Calcutta barrister, or lawyer, for Aziz's legal defense. Amritrao is strongly anti-British, and Fielding considers him too political and divisive. Fielding then returns to the college where Godbally, who will soon leave Chandrapur, talks to him about unrelated affairs, which Fielding hears impatiently. When Fielding, upset about what has happened, finally asks Godbally if Aziz is guilty, the professor, seeming unconcerned, gives him an indirect, enigmatic answer grounded in Hindu philosophy. Aziz, when Fielding finally sees him in jail, says, "You deserted me." That evening Turton presides over a meeting at the club in which he tells everyone to remain calm. Among the men, there are murmurs among the men about the women and children. Someone suggests calling in the army. Calendar accuses Aziz of bribing others and tries to goad Fielding. When Rani comes in, Fielding doesn't rise, which enrages Turton. Fielding then declares his belief in Aziz's innocence and resigns from the club. He then joins the Indians who are planning Aziz's defense as the Moharram holiday begins. Meanwhile, Adela is recuperating from cactus needles and a fever in the McBride's bungalow, but she still hears the Murabar echo. Rani and McBride tell her she will have to testify at the trial, and Fielding has sent her a letter telling her she made a mistake. When she returns to Rani's bungalow, Mrs. Moore is irritable and unsympathetic. She refuses to testify at the trial, and she even equates the assault in the cave with marriage. Adela wonders if she has made a mistake about Aziz, and then her echo goes away. When asked, Mrs. Moore says Aziz is innocent. Ronnie then schemes to send his mother back to England early, and the lieutenant governor's wife offers her a place in her cabin. On her way to Bombay, Mrs. Moore, who has been generally apathetic about everything since the episode in the cave, realizes she really hasn't seen India. The heat, which has been increasing, reaches a peak on the morning of the trial. Adela feels shaky, and her echo is back. On the way to the trial, the English talk viciously about the Indians as their car is pelted with small stones. In the courtroom, Adela focuses on the lowly punkah walla manual fan operator who stands opposite the judge running the trial. As McBride begins outlining the case against Aziz, someone in the courtroom says something upsetting to Adela. Major Calendar asks that she be seated on the platform to get more air, and then all the English follow her up onto the platform. When Amrita and Mahmood Ali protest, they all return to their seats. McBride then continues making his case, in which he calls Aziz a degenerate who duped others for his purposes. When he indirectly refers to Mrs. Moore, Mahmood Ali accuses the English of smuggling her out of the country so she could not testify, and quits the trial. This sets off a chant of "S Miss S Moore" in the courtroom and outside in the streets, which temporarily stops the trial. When McBride then takes Adela moment by moment through the day in question, she realizes Aziz never followed her into the cave and withdraws her accusation. The courtroom breaks out in chaos, the trial ends, and only the punkah walla is left pulling his rope. After the trial, Adela, now rejected by the British, has no place to go, so Fielding takes her in his carriage to Government College, although he'd rather be celebrating with Aziz. Aziz, surrounded by his supporters, misses Fielding, and some of his supporters want to organize a demonstration. They go to the hospital demanding to see Nuruddin, whom they heard had been tortured. There they meet Punnalai, on the list to testify for the British, who abases himself before them and fetches Nuruddin. A riot is avoided, and a victory celebration is planned at the mansion of the Nawab Bahadur, who renounces his English conferred title to become plain Mr. Zulfikar. That evening Adela tries to explain her behavior to Fielding and says her echo is gone. Fielding surmises McBride exorcised her by bringing her through the events of the day in question. He starts to like her honesty, and apologizes for his behavior to Ronnie. They wonder if the guide assaulted her. Then Hamidullah comes in to bring Fielding to the victory celebration. Fielding says Adela must stay at Government College, but Hamidullah objects to his taking responsibility for her. He doesn't admire Adela for her honesty because she showed no emotion. Just then Ronnie arrives and reports his mother died at sea. Hamidullah and Fielding discuss Mrs. Moore's death and decide not to tell Aziz until after the celebration. Adela decides to stay at Fielding's. On the way to the celebration, Amrita says Aziz will sue Adela for 20,000 rupees. On the roof after the victory party, Fielding tries to convince Aziz not to sue Adela for damages. He says Adela has been honest and urges Aziz to be merciful. Aziz says Adela ought to apologize first, and then he decides he will consult Mrs. Moore. Fielding, however, knows she is dead. When Aziz then proceeds to talk about his love for Mrs. Moore, Fielding says Aziz's emotions are out of proportion, claiming he is overly fond of Mrs. Moore yet ungenerous toward Adela. After her death at sea, Mrs. Moore becomes an object of worship among Indians, who set up 2 shrines to her. The lieutenant governor arrives, praising Fielding and ordering he be readmitted to the club. Fielding tries to help Adela write a letter of apology to Aziz, but she is unsuccessful. Finally, Fielding convinces Aziz to sue Adela for nothing more than court costs. Before Adela leaves for England, Ronnie has broken off the engagement. She and Fielding have one last talk in which they speculate about what might have happened in the cave. They assume the guide must have attacked her. They realize they have much in common and agree to remain friends. Adela decides to contact Mrs. Moore's other children, Stella and Ralph. Amid a new Hindu-Muslim understanding, Mr. Das asks Aziz to write a poem for a new magazine intended for all Indians. He also apologizes to Aziz for his role in the trial. Aziz never writes a suitable poem, but tells Hamidullah he wants to leave British India to write poetry. Hamidullah repeats a rumor suggesting Fielding and Adela were having an affair. This rumor grows real in Aziz's mind, and he repeats it to Fielding. Fielding doesn't care about the rumor, but because he doesn't deny it immediately, Aziz presses him until he insults Aziz. They meet again for a planned dinner and try to discuss poetry, but Aziz can't help suspecting Fielding intends to marry Adela for her money when he goes to England. Fielding tries to patch things up before leaving, but he is unsuccessful. Part 3. Temple 2 years later, during the monsoon season in the Hindu state of Mount, Godbally, as Minister of Education, is celebrating a festival in honor of the birth of Krishna, when the thought of Mrs. Moore comes into his mind. Old and ailing, the Raja, after playing a role in the ceremony, is examined by his doctors, one of whom is Aziz. Godbally tells him Fielding, who works for the British government, has arrived in Mao to inspect schools. He has come with his brother-in-law and his wife. Aziz assumes she is Adela. Although Aziz had received numerous letters from Fielding, he read only part of the first one, giving it to Mahmud Ali to answer, and then destroyed all subsequent letters without reading them. Aziz, now working for an Indian ruler and living with his children, has no desire to renew contacts with the British. Part of the holy festival involves the freeing of a prisoner in honor of a Muslim saint whose shrine is near Aziz's house. Aziz knows the Raja has died, but this is being kept a secret until after the festival. The next day Aziz and his children bump into Fielding and his brother-in-law, Ralph, who gets stung by bees. When Aziz addresses the latter as Mr. Quest, Fielding tells Aziz he has made a mistake. Fielding has married Stella, Mrs. Moore's daughter. Ralph is her brother. As the festival continues, Aziz rides over to the European guest house to bring Ralph the ointment he promised him. He enters the house and reads private letters from Ronnie and Adela to the Fieldings. When Ralph comes in, Aziz examines him roughly, and Ralph protests his cruelty. Ralph is intuitive like his mother, and Aziz calls him an Oriental just as he called Mrs. Moore. Aziz then takes Ralph out in a boat to observe the festival. At the climax of the proceedings, their boat collides with another boat containing the Fieldings as elephants trumpet and artillery fires. Finally, Aziz and Fielding, now reconciled, take one last ride in the jungle. Aziz has written a letter to Adela, thanking her for her bravery, and he apologizes to Fielding for his suspicions. Fielding tells Aziz his wife and brother-in-law have a spiritual side he doesn't understand. Then the discussion turns to politics, and Aziz tells Fielding they cannot be friends until the Indians drive the English out of India.